Hi everyone, this is Peter, and welcome to the History Shorts podcast. This humble show is brought to you by the Podcast Republic, your ultimate listening app. Discover and subscribe to thousands of podcasts from around the globe, yours truly included, all in one place. Download Podcast Republic now, available on Google Play and the Apple App Store. Today on History Shorts. It's April 1861, and the nation stands on the brink of collapse. Cannons thunder at Fort Sumter, smoke rises over Charleston Harbor, and the United States is about to descend into its bloodiest conflict. Newspapers across the North and South are filled with fiery rhetoric, speeches, and declarations. Yet amid the chaos, a critical question divides historians and contemporaries alike. What truly caused the Civil War? Was it the abstract principle of states' rights, the idea that each state should govern itself without federal interference? Or was it the institution of slavery itself, the morally fraught and economically central system of forced labor in the South? Secession declarations from Southern states and President Abraham Lincoln's inaugural address provide starkly contrasting perspectives. And so, today, on this episode of the History Shorts new series, You Decide, we explore both sides of this enduring debate and examine the evidence so you yourself can weigh which factor was the primary cause of America's deadliest war.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
By the mid-19th century, the United States was a nation divided by geography, economy, and ideology. The South relied heavily on agriculture, particularly cotton, and the labor of enslaved people. The North was increasingly industrialized, with factories, railroads, and a growing urban workforce. These economic differences were intertwined with political and moral questions about the expansion and the existence of slavery. Tensions escalated as new territories were added to the Union. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the Compromise of 1850 attempted to balance the number of slave and free states, but these temporary solutions failed to resolve underlying conflicts. The passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, which allowed territories to decide the legality of slavery by popular sovereignty, sparked violence known as Bleeding Kansas, and illustrated the volatility of the issue. Southern states increasingly framed their grievances in terms of what they called states' rights, claiming that the federal government had no authority to interfere with their domestic institutions. Northern abolitionists and politicians, however, viewed slavery as the moral and political crisis at the heart of the nation. Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860, without winning a single Southern electoral vote, I should add, convinced many Southern leaders that slavery and the political power associated with it was under existential threat, prompting secession declarations from South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. So now let us examine the two sides of the coin, or the two sides of the issue. To make this simpler, I'll refer to the Civil War being about states' rights simply as Side A, and I'll refer to the war caused by slavery as the primary issue as Side B. So let's begin with Side A. Side A argues that Civil War was fundamentally about states' rights, and that the seceding states were primarily defending their sovereignty, guaranteed to them under the Constitution. Southern leaders repeatedly asserted that their decision to leave the Union was a constitutional remedy to protect their authority against perceived federal overreach. For example, South Carolina's Declaration of Secession in 1860 emphasized that, and I quote, the powers not expressly delegated to the United States by the Constitution remain with the states." End quote. They framed their actions not as a moral crusade over slavery, but as a defense of their legal autonomy. Supporters of this perspective highlight the long history of Southern resistance to federal encroachment. The nullification crisis of 1832-33, in which South Carolina attempted to nullify federal tariffs, illustrated that disputes over state authority were definitely long-standing. Southern politicians viewed any perceived federal interference, whether tariffs, infrastructure regulations, or internal governance, as a threat to their sovereignty of the states. Even during the Secession crisis, Southern leaders initially couched their grievances in terms of political authority. They feared that the election of Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party without Southern electoral support represented an encroachment on their ability to govern their own affairs. In his first inaugural address, Lincoln reassured the Southern states that he would not interfere with slavery where it already existed, emphasizing his focus on preserving the Union rather than attacking Southern institutions. Proponents also point to practical concerns unrelated to slavery. Disputes over tariffs, trade policies, and federal infrastructure projects had long fueled sectional tensions. The Southern states argued that federal policies were favoring Northern economic interests at their own expense, from protective tariffs on manufactured goods to control over interstate commerce. From this perspective, the war's root cause was a structural conflict between federal authority and the constitutional rights of states, with slavery as just one issue among many. Furthermore, many Southerners who cited states' rights did so in legalistic, constitutional terms. Their rhetoric emphasized principles of self-governance, the compact theory of the Union, and the right of a state to withdraw from a compact if the federal government violated its terms. Battles over jurisdiction, governance, and local control reflected a broader vision of autonomy. And so, Side A suggests that while slavery was involved, the immediate trigger and central justification for secession rested on these constitutional and political principles. So now, let us flip the coin. Side B, or the side that says war was caused primarily by slavery, contends that slavery was the central cause of the Civil War, with states' rights serving largely as rhetorical cover. While Southern leaders framed secession in terms of constitutional principles, the underlying issue was the preservation and expansion of slavery. Southern secession documents are very explicit. Mississippi declared that, and I quote, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world." End quote. Texas, Georgia, and Louisiana made similar statements, prioritizing the protection of slavery above other political or economic concerns. Slavery was not just a social system, but the economic foundation of the South. Cotton, the dominant cash crop, relied on enslaved labor, and Southern wealth and political influence depended directly on maintaining that system. Northern opposition to the expansion of slavery into new territories threatened Southern economic and political power. Republican victories culminating in Lincoln's 1860 election convinced Southern elites that their ability to control this institution was thus under immediate threat. Side B also emphasizes that secession followed a consistent pattern. Whether slavery was central to the economy, states moved toward leaving the Union. States with less dependence on slavery or more mixed economies were much slower or hesitant to secede. This correlation suggests that while states' rights were invoked in rhetoric, the specific right at stake here was the right to maintain slavery. Even military and political strategies support this interpretation. Confederate leadership immediately sought to preserve slavery as a cornerstone of society, drafting constitutions that guaranteed the institution and enshrined protections for slaveholders. The Confederate Constitution mirrored the U.S. Constitution in form, but it explicitly emphasized slavery, indicating its centrality to the Southern cause. Historical patterns also reinforce this argument. Previous disputes over tariffs, internal improvements, or federal authority had not resulted in secession or war. What was unique in 1860 or 61 was that slavery, the most deeply entrenched and economically essential institution in the South, was now politically imperiled. Battles, negotiations, and even Lincoln's attempts at compromise centered around the question of slavery's future, making it the primary, irreducible cause of the conflict. Side B contends that without the existential threat to slavery, secession and war would never have occurred. The rhetoric of states' rights, while legally significant, was inseparable from the defense of slavery as an economic, social, and political institution. The war's human cost, over 600,000 lives, was ultimately fought over this single institution and the Southern elite's desire to protect it. So let us reflect and get to some questions. The Civil War was both a constitutional and a moral conflict, and understanding its cause requires examining both perspectives. Side A emphasizes the legal and structural arguments. Disputes over states' rights and the federal authority created a context in which Southern states felt justified in seceding. Side B today reminds us that slavery was the institution that made compromise impossible, shaping political, economic, and social imperatives, and thus triggering the war. So, by studying secession declarations, Lincoln's speeches, and the broader historical context, it becomes clear that states' rights and slavery were actually deeply intertwined. Constitutional arguments were used to justify secession, but the underlying issue of those very arguments, and the one that mobilized Southern society, dictated Confederate policy and drove the scale of the conflict, that was slavery. So ultimately, the Civil War illustrates how legal principles, economic interests, and moral issues intersect in shaping history. But before I let you go, as is always the case, this episode only scratched the surface of the issue. There is a plethora of sources available for analysis, evaluation, and discussion out there for you guys to look at. Treat it more as an inspiration to go and dig deeper. For some further exploration, I suggest secession declarations from South Carolina, Mississippi, and other southern states, which are available through Yale's Avalon Project. You could find those online. Also, I strongly suggest The Impending Crisis, 1848 to 1861, by David M. Potter. Now, for the good of the order, this upcoming Friday's Conversation Series guest is Roger Morehouse. We talk about his latest book, Wolfpack: Inside Hitler's U-Boat War. Hopefully today's episode has inspired you to seek out and learn more about the subject. For answers to questions, to leave a comment, or check out upcoming guest announcements, visit www.historyshortspodcast.com or look for History Shorts Podcast on Facebook and X. Stay curious, everybody, and I'll talk to you all tomorrow.